It is the 2nd of September 1870. At the French border near Sedan, the once proud armies of France have been encircled by their Prussian and German foes and are being relentlessly pummeled with artillery fire. The air, thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded, surrounds the French emperor who, after realizing there is no escape, sends a letter to the enemy offering his unconditional surrender. Soon afterwards, he is taken prisoner and is forced to abdicate, sealing both his and France's humiliation. The man's name? Napoleon III, the last emperor of the French. The man known to history as Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, was born in Paris in the early hours of the 20th of April 1808. He was given the name Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte by his paternal uncle, Emperor Napoleon I, on the 2nd of June 1808, an unusual occurrence 6 weeks after his birth, though one accounted for by the fact that the emperor viewed his young nephew as a potential successor to him one day. The young prince's father was Louis Bonaparte, Emperor Napoleon I's younger brother. Born in 1778, 9 years after Napoleon, Louis effectively became Napoleon's surrogate son after their father, Carlo's premature death at just 38 years of age in 1785. The Bonapartes came from the Mediterranean island of Corsica and were Italian in origin, but Napoleon's military victories in the French Revolutionary Wars brought him to power in Paris in 1799. After proclaiming himself as Emperor of the French in 1804, effectively bringing any semblance of the French Revolution to an end, Napoleon defeated the armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia in successive campaigns between 1805 and 1807, leaving him master of the European continent. As part of this process, he established several satellite kingdoms, some of which had been conquered by the French Republic back in the 1790s. These had originally been formed into sister republics, but now Napoleon transformed them into vassal kingdoms to be ruled by his family members. In June 1806, Louis was named as King of Holland, roughly corresponding to the modern-day Netherlands. Even before Napoleon became emperor, he was desperate for an heir. But by the turn of the century, his wife, Josephine, was in her late 30s, and it seemed that no legitimate heir would ever result from the marriage. While Napoleon adopted Eugène and Hortense, Josephine's children from her first marriage to the late Alexandre de Beauharnais, he was keen to continue the Bonaparte family name in one shape or another, so that if no direct male heir arrived, he could establish a nephew to succeed him one day. In January 1802, Napoleon arranged for his 18-year-old stepdaughter, Hortense, to marry his 23-year-old brother, Louis. Napoleon could adopt the offspring from this union as his heirs in the event that Josephine could not provide him with a child. In October 1802, the couple had their first son, Napoleon Charles, but the marriage between the depressive Louis and the vivacious Hortense proved an unhappy one. Soon after the birth of a second son, confusingly called Napoleon Louis in October 1804, the couple began living apart. A brief reconciliation following the death of Napoleon Charles in May 1807 resulted in the birth of the future Napoleon III the following April. The young Charles Louis Napoleon soon came to be known as Louis Napoleon, in contrast to his older brother, Napoleon Louis. Following his birth, the King of Holland suspected that the child was not his own and was rather the fruit of some affair of Hortense's. While doubts about the boy's paternity lingered for decades, most historians and biographers now agree that Louis Napoleon was, in fact, the son of Louis Bonaparte. Although he owed his throne to his brother, King Louis prioritized the interests of his Dutch subjects over Napoleon's demands to subordinate the Dutch to French rule. Napoleon's frustration at his brother's refusal to do his bidding led him to depose Louis in 1810 and annex Holland directly into the French Empire. As a child, the young Louis Napoleon saw little of his father, but was devoted to his mother, who brought him up to be self-reliant and not to depend on the trappings of royalty. Nevertheless, he was a favoured member of the imperial family in Paris, even after Napoleon divorced Josephine in 1810 to marry the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, who gave him his first and only legitimate son, Napoleon Francois-Joseph Charles, proclaimed as the King of Rome in March 1811. This meant Louis Napoleon was essentially no longer his uncle's heir. The same year, Louis and Hortense formally separated, and the latter began an affair with General Charles de Flahaut, himself the illegitimate son of the statesman Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, a former bishop who served as Napoleon's foreign minister for several years. When this liaison resulted in the birth of a son, Charles-Auguste de Morny, Napoleon was incensed and insisted on their separation. After Napoleon launched his ill-fated Russian campaign in the summer of 1812, Louis Napoleon saw little of his uncle, who was forced to abdicate in April 1814 when Paris was occupied by a coalition army of Austrians, Prussians, and Russians. The traditional royal House of Bourbon, which had ruled France from the late 16th century until it was overthrown during the Revolution, was restored under King Louis XVIII, a younger brother of Louis XVI, who had been executed in 1793. Over the following weeks, Tsar Alexander I of Russia paid several visits to Hortense and Josephine at Malmaison near Paris. When Josephine died unexpectedly in May, Alexander comforted Hortense and secured her an allowance of 400,000 francs and the title of Duchesse de Saint-Lô from King Louis. In recognition of the Russian Tsar's favour to his mother, the 6-year-old Louis Napoleon gifted him a ring he had received from his uncle Eugène. In late February 1815, Napoleon escaped from exile on the island of Elba off the Italian coast and landed in southern France. As he marched towards Paris, gathering defectors from the king's army on the way, Hortense was warned that her family was in danger from the Bourbons and sent her sons into hiding in early March. 2 weeks later, Hortense greeted Napoleon as he returned to Paris in triumph on the 20th of March. The following day, the emperor ecstatically received her 2 sons and forgave Hortense for cozying up to his enemies. As Empress Marie-Louise and the King of Rome were in Austria and prevented from rejoining Napoleon, Hortense and her children played a prominent role in the restoration ceremonies. While Napoleon claimed that he only wanted peace, the Allied powers of Europe declared him an outlaw, and Austria, Prussia, Russia and Britain each promised to field 150,000 men to overthrow him a second time. In response, Bonaparte launched a preemptive strike against the British and Prussian forces gathering in the Low Countries. On the 11th of June, he bid farewell to Hortense and her boys before leading his 120,000-strong army of the north towards Brussels. A week later, on the 18th of June, Napoleon met his final defeat at Waterloo. After returning to Paris, he abdicated in favor of his son, who theoretically reigned for a few days as Napoleon II. On the 29th of June, Napoleon took his leave from Hortense and her sons at Malmaison and hoped to go into exile in the United States. Such ambitions were thwarted, and Napoleon was instead obliged to surrender to the British and condemned to live out his days on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. In the meantime, Hortense and her sons left Paris in mid-July, heading east towards the Swiss border. On the 20th of July, 1815, 3 days after leaving Paris, Hortense was arrested at Dijon by royalist officers. The intervention of Count Eduard von Weuner, an Austrian cavalry officer escorting the small party, enabled Hortense and her sons to be released, and they reached Geneva and safety in the Swiss Confederacy that evening. Unfortunately, they were refused permission to stay by the authorities, and Hortense was eventually obliged to return to France, taking refuge at the spa town of Aix-les-Bains within the Austrian zone of occupation. In early October, she was forced to give up custody of her elder son to her former husband, who was now living in exile in Rome. Furthermore, later that month, the Austrians informed Hortense that they could no longer guarantee her security, while the Allied powers determined that she should be exiled to Switzerland, where she had previously sought asylum unsuccessfully. Despite this Austrian proposal, none of the famously independent Swiss cantons were willing to grant her refuge, believing her presence there would be disruptive, and eventually she persuaded her cousin, Stephanie de Beauharnais, wife of the Grand Duke of Baden in the far south of Germany, to allow her to live in the town of Constance on the northern shore of Lake Constance. During her search for a permanent residence, Hortense came upon a small castle in Switzerland on the opposite shore of the lake called Arenenberg, and agreed to purchase it in February 1817, though she could only use it as a summer residence until she received consent from the Allied powers to live there all the year round. The same month, Hortense and Louis Napoleon were ordered to leave Baden, and in May they made the journey to Augsburg in Bavaria, whose king was Eugène de Beauharnais' father-in-law. Louis Napoleon was 9 years old when he arrived in Augsburg with his mother and a small party of staff. Among them was his tutor, a kindly cleric named Bertrand, who did not care much about formal lessons. The boy learned more from his mother, who taught him to draw and constantly reminded him of the achievements of his uncle, Emperor Napoleon. Hortense expressed hope that her two children might one day find an opportunity to lay claim to their uncle's political mantle, but she was aware that Louis Napoleon still required a formal education and that the Abbé Bertrand was not up to the task. Accordingly, in 1820, she secured the services of Philippe Lebas, a stern young scholar from a family of revolutionaries. Upon arriving at Arenenberg, the new tutor observed that his 12-year-old pupil resembled a 7-year-old who had no understanding of the basics of many subjects. To remedy this, he imposed a strict timetable, making the teenager wake up at 6 in the morning and sit through over 9 hours of lessons each day in Latin, German, Greek, arithmetic, geography, and history. This work was initially interspersed with walking in the mountains and swimming in the lakes, but Lebas soon removed them from the schedule and replaced them with more classes. Louis Napoleon initially struggled to cope with this increased workload, but over time his academic performance improved, and in April 1821 he began attending the high school at Augsburg. Despite his difficulties with the German language, Louis Napoleon came fourth in a class of over 60 students in the end-of-term examinations in early 1822. By this time, Hortense had been granted permission to take up permanent residence in Arenenberg after the death of the former Emperor Napoleon far away on St. Helena in May 1821, though Louis Napoleon continued to live at Augsburg with his tutor's family until 1823, at which time Hortense recalled him to Arenenberg. At this juncture, the teenager's father, Louis Bonaparte, returned onto the scene. The former King of Holland now wished to be reacquainted with his youngest son. They spent some time together at the spa town of Marienbad in what is now the Czech Republic, while they also visited Rome. Hortense was pleased to re-establish contact with the many Bonaparte exiles who lived in the Eternal City, and the social life had much more to offer compared to her Swiss backwater at Arenenberg. To the dismay of Philippe Lebas, Hortense encouraged her younger son to play his full part in Rome's social life, from hunting to dining to dancing. With the exception of 1825, after Eugène de Beauharnais died unexpectedly in Bavaria, Hortense and Louis Napoleon routinely spent their winters in Rome. Lebas' complaints that the young man was neglecting his studies were largely ignored, and Hortense dismissed him in 1827. The 19-year-old Louis Napoleon was otherwise glad to be rid of his dour tutor and enjoyed a carefree lifestyle in Rome, often in the arms of local peasant girls. One of his biographers rejects the conventional notion that the young man was always convinced that he would emulate his illustrious uncle by becoming Emperor of France one day. Louis Napoleon remained several steps from the official Bonapartist succession, and the family was out of power in any event, with seemingly no route back to it in France, with the royal house of Bourbon re-established. There were also more senior claimants to the leadership of the family from amongst his generation. In addition to his elder brother, who was also Napoleon's legitimate son, the former King of Rome, who was being brought up in Vienna as Franz Duke of Reichstadt. Moreover, Louis Napoleon's own father was still alive, as was his uncle Joseph, the eldest of the Bonaparte brothers, who was in exile in the United States. Thus, from the vantage point of the late 1820s, few would have viewed Louis Napoleon as a future ruler of any kind. In 1829, as Louis Napoleon entered his early 20s, he was keen to follow in his uncle's footsteps and acquire military experience. He hoped to enlist in the Russian army, which was then supporting the Greeks in their struggle for independence against the Ottoman Turks, but was refused by his father, who did not want his son fighting in Russian uniform. Louis Napoleon therefore decided to study artillery and engineering at the Swiss Military Academy. His fate would change late in 1830 during what was initially a routine winter break in Rome. Upon arrival in Rome, he found that his elder brother had become a committed revolutionary. A few months earlier, in July, the unpopular Bourbon king, Charles X, was deposed in France in a revolution and replaced by a distant cousin, King Louis-Philippe I. While the new king confirmed a prohibition from 1816, preventing the Bonapartes from returning to France, clandestine revolutionaries were also active in Italy, which remained a disunited collection of princely states. Northern and central states such as Milan and Tuscany were controlled by Austria. Central Italy was ruled by the Pope in Rome, while the southern half of the peninsula was controlled by the Bourbon king of Sicily and Naples. Beneath the surface, a radical nationalist movement known as the Carbonari operated against foreign occupiers. Since the cause of Italian nationalism had been championed by Napoleon, and Eugène de Beauharnais had been viceroy of the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy, it was natural for a Bonaparte to join the Carbonari. Louis Napoleon followed his brother's lead, and the two young men skirmished with papal forces in Rome and fled to Florence. To the dismay of their parents, they saw action in January 1831 against papal troops near Bologna, but their presence was a diplomatic embarrassment to the revolutionaries seeking military aid from France. While Hortense was on her way to rescue her sons, Napoleon Louis died of measles on the 17th of March in the small town of Forlì. Hortense caught up with her surviving son at Pesaro on the Adriatic coast a few days later. After catching the disease that killed his brother, Louis Napoleon was himself in poor health and could not travel. A couple of weeks later, he made his escape disguised as one of his mother's servants. In mid-April 1831, mother and son crossed into France in secret, where Hortense was granted a secret audience with King Louis-Philippe. Despite the king's personal sympathies, he was obliged to request them to leave after news leaked of the presence of members of the Bonaparte family in France. Hence, on the 10th of May 1831, Louis Napoleon and his mother crossed the English Channel to Britain, and over the next 3 months the young man recovered his health under the care of a doctor in London. After returning to Arenenberg in late August, Louis Napoleon returned to the Swiss Military Academy, continued his womanizing, and enjoyed the company of 2 close friends: his cousin, Charles-Henri Bac, the illegitimate son of Napoleon's youngest brother Jérôme, and Henri Conneau, a doctor whom he had first met during his Italian misadventures the previous year. After the death of his brother, Louis Napoleon now increasingly viewed himself as the standard-bearer of the Bonapartist cause. In June 1832, he published a book entitled Rêveries politiques, or Political Daydreams, in which he proposed his uncle's system of imperial meritocracy as a remedy for France's political woes. Officially, the Bonapartes continued to regard the Duke of Reichstadt, Emperor Napoleon's biological son, as the head of the Bonapartist line and harboured hopes that he might break free from his maternal relatives in Austria to claim his father's legacy. Such faint hopes were extinguished with the young prince's death in July 1832, at the age of 20, from a combination of tuberculosis and pneumonia. With his passing, 24-year-old Louis Napoleon was now the senior Bonaparte of his generation, a figure on whom many of the family's hopes would increasingly be pinned. Although he did not yet seek to advance his political ambitions, in August 1832, Louis Napoleon travelled to Liverpool in England, where he deputized for his father in a meeting with his uncles, Joseph, Lucien and Jérôme, to discuss the affairs of the wider Bonaparte family. The elder Bonapartes were keen to come to an agreement with King Louis Philippe to restore their property in France, and recognized that their recently deceased nephew's actions in Italy had undermined their cause. Louis Napoleon remained in Britain for several months, where he was impressed by the economic development of the country after half a century of industrialization, but appalled by the conditions of the urban industrial working class. He took a ride on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway and wrote excitedly to his mother about the experience. By May 1833, he was back at Arenenberg, where he published a book on political and military issues in Switzerland. The following year, he wrote a 500-page artillery manual, which was adopted by the Swiss army. Despite such accomplishments, Louis Napoleon was approaching his late 20s and feeling increasingly restless. The catalyst for change came in July 1835, when an ardent Bonapartist, calling himself the Comte de Persigny, arrived at Arenenberg. The two men quickly became close friends and began plotting an insurrection, inspired by Napoleon's escape from Elba. Having secured the support of Colonel Vaudreuil of the 4th Artillery Regiment in Strasbourg, the coup began at dawn on the 30th of October 1836. Although the king and his ministers were terrified by the news, the troops in Strasbourg remained loyal and refused to obey Louis Napoleon's orders. After a desperate struggle, the plotters were taken captive a mere 2 hours after launching their attempted coup. While Louis Napoleon was convinced that he would be executed for treason, Louis Philippe had no intention of making him a martyr and ordered him into exile in North America. Louis Napoleon's exile in North America was short-lived. He headed to the United States via London and Brazil and spent a few months in New York City before he received news that his mother was planning to have a risky cancer operation back in Europe. Perturbed by this, he hurried back across the Atlantic and spent several frustrating weeks in England before receiving permission to travel to Switzerland at the end of July. His return to Arenenberg briefly lifted Hortense's spirits, but could not prevent her from succumbing to her illness in October 1837, leaving her son a vast fortune in the process. The day after her death, Louis Napoleon was presented with correspondence between Hortense and her illegitimate son, Charles-Auguste de Morny. The discovery was an unwelcome one, and he made no attempt to establish contact with de Morny in the late 1830s, although the two men would later become close political associates. Louis Napoleon could not bear to live in Oranienburg without his mother, and moved a few miles along the shore of Lake Constance, while the French government increased pressure on the local authorities to expel the Bonaparte prince. Louis Napoleon responded by orchestrating the publication of a pamphlet glorifying the failed Strasbourg coup. The French government's overreaction served to elevate Louis Napoleon's reputation in France, while the Swiss authorities refused to bow down to French pressure to expel him. Still, Louis Napoleon left Switzerland anyway of his own accord and headed for London yet again, where he established himself at a prestigious address in Carlton Gardens, round the corner from Buckingham Palace. The future British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was among the writers and politicians who visited him there as this nephew of the great Emperor of the French of yesteryear took up residence in the capital of the nation that had been the bitterest enemy of the Bonapartist cause. Louis Napoleon had an active social life in London, but unbeknownst to those who he socialized alongside in the British capital, the nephew of the emperor who had once nearly conquered all of Europe was planning another coup to try and claim power in France. With the wealth he inherited from his mother, he financed Bonapartist newspapers and political clubs in Paris, and in July 1839, he published a 250-page manifesto addressed to the French masses. In this, he argued that the Napoleonic system was the perfect combination of liberty and democracy, with a strong central government committed to the improvement of the country and its people, while avoiding the excesses of mob rule or the instability of party politics. He was at pains to refute arguments that the Napoleonic empire of his uncle had been a military dictatorship, pointing out that the government administration of that time was entirely run by civilian bureaucrats appointed on merit. The book, entitled Idées Napoléoniennes, or Napoleonic Ideas, sold thousands of copies and was translated into 6 languages. Following the experience of the earlier coup at Strasbourg, he recognized that if he was to take power with a second attempt at insurrection, he had to be better prepared. Thus, he made detailed plans for an uprising in northern France and reached out to Bertrand Clausel, one of Emperor Napoleon's few distinguished generals that was still alive. He had subsequently been made a Marshal of France by Louis Philippe, but latterly fell out with the king. By 1840, Louis Philippe's government was more unpopular than it had ever been, and in an effort to restore his popularity, the king obtained permission from Britain to transfer Napoleon's remains from St. Helena to France. Louis Napoleon could not bear the thought of being absent for the repatriation of his uncle's body and launched his second attempt to seize power. On the 7th of August, 1840, Louis Napoleon landed at Bologna on the coast of northern France near the port of Calais at the head of a body of 60 men, including General Charles de Montholon, one of the few men who had accompanied Napoleon into exile on the island of St. Helena. Once again, the local authorities refused to do his bidding. One of the party managed to fly the imperial flag from the column of the Grand Army, built to commemorate the great army camp Napoleon established in Bologna many years earlier as he prepared for an invasion of England that was ultimately abandoned in 1805. As the king's troops gathered around the motley crew of Bonapartists, Louis Napoleon drew his sword but was bundled away by his associates. He was lightly wounded by gunfire in the melee that ensued as he attempted to escape on a boat with 5 of his companions. He was then amongst the 4 survivors who were taken into captivity by the royal troops. Louis Napoleon's second attempted coup had been just as disastrous as the first. Unlike at Strasbourg, though, the French government was not inclined to be forgiving on this occasion. Instead, the future Napoleon III was tried for treason before the aristocratic court of peers. While he defended the Bonapartist cause during his trial and attempted to assume sole responsibility for the coup, he and most of his co-conspirators were given punitive sentences. The Bonapartist pretender was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment and taken to the Château d'Am, a crumbling medieval fortress in northeastern France, where he shared his captivity with Conneau, General Montholon, and his devoted valet Charles Télin, who chose to serve his master in prison despite being completely innocent. Louis Napoleon came down with rheumatism in the squalid conditions that he was imprisoned in. In an effort to improve his circumstances, he convinced his jailers to allow him to renovate his rooms, replacing the floor and acquiring a few pieces of furniture. Although under constant supervision, he was, of course, allowed to read, and he built bookshelves to house his extensive library. It was shortly before Christmas 1840 that he learned that his uncle's remains were finally being reinterred at the Chapel of the Invalides, military hospital founded by King Louis XIV on the south bank of the Seine, after they were brought back from St. Helena. From his captivity, Louis Napoleon wrote a tribute to his uncle, which appeared in the French press. As the months passed, the prisoner worked his charm on his captors, and his conditions gradually improved. He was allowed to conduct scientific experiments and was given permission to plant a small garden on the prison grounds. By the middle of 1841, he was allowed to receive visitors, and his valet was given permission to come in and out of the prison as he pleased, bringing him vital updates about what was occurring in France. He was even permitted to keep a mistress, the 20-year-old Eleanor Vergeot, who gave birth to a son named Eugène in February 1843, followed by a son named Louis 2 years later. In the meantime, he became a prolific political commentator for various newspapers and wrote another political pamphlet, The Extinction of Pauperism, published in April 1844, in which he combined the socialist desire to improve the condition of the masses with Bonapartist statist ideas. His key proposal was to set up workers' associations to buy up undeveloped land with state loans. Although he kept himself busy, Louis Napoleon was desperate to be a free man, and the vast fortune he had inherited from his mother was almost entirely exhausted. His uncle, Joseph, had died in July 1844, and his father, Louis, was in seriously poor health. In August 1845, Louis Napoleon wrote to his father expressing his wish to see him one last time, but the latter failed to secure his son's release on compassionate grounds. The prisoner then personally wrote to the king requesting a pardon, but to no avail. After more than half a decade incarcerated for the attempted coup at Bologna, Louis Napoleon saw no other option than to try and escape from the chateau, despite the high level of security around him. As he and Conneau considered their options, a gang of workers turned up at the fortress to carry out some long overdue repairs in April 1846. After careful observation, the pair identified several weaknesses in the security procedures involving the workmen, and on the 25th of May, Louis Napoleon walked out of prison disguised as one of the labourers. In the chateau, the faithful Conneau won him time by informing prison officials that Louis Napoleon was ill. By the time they realized the duplicity, the fugitive was already on his way to Belgium. 2 days later, he crossed over to England and resumed his position in London society. After a further request to visit his dying father in Florence was refused by the Austrian authorities, the former King of Holland died in July 1846. Louis Napoleon inherited a large fortune from his father, but, more importantly, was now the head of the House of Bonaparte under the terms of the 1804 law of succession that his uncle had established. Despite his fortune, Louis Napoleon spent beyond his means in London, incurring substantial debts and obliging him to seek financial assistance from the Rothschilds and other prominent banking houses of the time. He conducted a brief affair with Mademoiselle Rachel, a famous French actress, before embarking on a more enduring liaison with an attractive, if undistinguished actress named Elizabeth Ann Harriet, better known as Miss Howard, who had been living as the common-law wife of an English Guards officer. A wealthy woman in her own right, Lizzie Howard helped to finance Louis Napoleon's lifestyle and his latest political plans. Events in France were soon to provide an opportunity for him to finally seize power there. Across the English Channel, King Louis Philippe's government was popular in the 1840s, but a poor harvest and widespread flooding in 1846 caused an economic downturn and inspired calls for reform from the middle classes. The aging king's efforts to suppress the liberal opposition triggered revolution on the streets of Paris early in 1848. Within days, it became clear that the opposition to him remaining as king was intense, and on the 24th of February, he abdicated the throne. The parliamentary deputies proclaimed the establishment of the Second French Republic. Louis Napoleon arrived to the French capital 4 days later. The provisional government was sceptical of the Bonapartist prince's conversion to republicanism and ordered him to return to England. Louis Napoleon complied with the instruction and was happy to remain an observer as the provisional government struggled to assert its authority. In April 1848, 3 of Louis Napoleon's Bonaparte cousins were elected to the Constituent Assembly, while Louis Napoleon's supporters in France campaigned for him in an additional round of elections in June, and he was elected, though he remained cautious and refused to take up the seat. The provisional government collapsed a few days later, and Parisian workers returned to the streets. An interim military government under War Minister General Louis Cavaignac assumed emergency powers to restore order. By August, Louis Napoleon decided it was time to act, to which end he won a seat in the Constituent Assembly in a further round of elections in September. Upon taking his oath of office in September, he expressed his gratitude to the Republic for restoring his citizenship after 33 years as an exile and criminal in the eyes of the French state. In November, the Assembly adopted a new constitution, one which provided for a powerful president limited to a single 4-year term. Louis Napoleon emerged as the favorite for the presidency and, after running an energetic campaign, was declared the winner with over 5 million votes, or 75% of total votes cast, in December 1848. At long last, at 40 years of age and after 2 attempted coups, Louis Napoleon had emerged as head of the French state, the first Bonapartist to do so since his uncle's final defeat 33 years earlier. After entering office, he established his residence at the Élysée Palace, one of his uncle's former homes, which remains the official residence for the French president to this day. He installed his mistress and financial backer, Miss Howard, in a nearby house, where she brought up her own son alongside the president's 2 illegitimate sons. When he set about appointing his ministers, Louis Napoleon invited Odilon Barrot, leader of the parliamentary opposition to Louis Philippe, to be his prime minister. The new president soon appointed Persigny as his ambassador to Prussia, promoted Colonel Vaudreuil to general, and made Dr. Conneau his principal physician. Clearly, the new Napoleon who ruled France would, like his uncle, reward his allies. Louis Napoleon spent much of his presidency travelling around the country, opening railway lines, visiting schools and hospitals, and inspecting army units. On these visits, he was routinely greeted with chants of "Vive Napoléon" and "Vive le Président," as well as the occasional "Vive l'Empereur." These demonstrations of public support increased the president's confidence, and on the 31st of October 1849, he dismissed Barrot from his post, believing he no longer needed a prime minister. Several months earlier, in June 1849, the government crushed an uprising by radical socialists. In May 1850, their conservative opponents, led by former Prime Minister Adolphe Thiers, used their majority in the National Assembly to pass a bill restricting the franchise, targeting both the leftists and the president. By 1851, the conservative opposition in the National Assembly was preventing Louis Napoleon from carrying out much of his political program. Moreover, his single term as president was coming to an end. That summer, he sought to persuade the Assembly to extend his presidential term, but failed to receive the required supermajority to change the constitution. He reluctantly turned to contingency plans developed by Persigny and his half-brother, Charles-Auguste de Morny, who had joined his political inner circle in January 1849. Just over 50 years earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power in France in the Coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799. His nephew was now planning to overthrow the Second Republic in a similar fashion. De Morny mobilized support from his protégé, General Jacques Leroy de Saint-Arnaud, who was recalled to Paris from North Africa and appointed as Minister of War. The date was set for the 2nd of December, a symbolic date marking the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation as emperor in 1804 and his great victory over the Russians and Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Louis Napoleon's men occupied the National Assembly's premises at the Palais Bourbon. Chief of Police Émile Maupas proceeded to arrest parliamentary deputies at their homes over the course of the morning, while a series of proclamations in the president's name were plastered throughout Paris, announcing the dissolution of the Assembly. Louis Napoleon blamed the Assembly for violating the Constitution by restricting the franchise and laid out the principles for a new constitution with a strong executive whose decisions were ratified by a popular assembly elected by universal male suffrage. By 11 o'clock, Louis Napoleon rode in triumph through the gates of the Élysée, accompanied by his uncle Jérôme, Napoleon's last surviving brother. Around 1,000 insurgents built barricades to resist the coup, but the following day, General Saint-Arnaud's troops brutally suppressed the uprisings, killing over 300 people in the process. A series of uprisings that broke out throughout the country over the following week were suppressed with equal brutality by government troops. Following the coup, Louis Napoleon held a referendum on a new constitution, which received overwhelming support. On New Year's Day, 1852, he moved into a suite of rooms that had once been occupied by the Empress Josephine in the Tuileries Palace in the centre of Paris. Under the terms of the Constitution of January 1852, President Louis Napoleon had the sole right to appoint ministers and initiate laws. Not content with being an emperor in all but name, he embarked on a nationwide tour to promote the cause of imperial government and secured his imperial title after a further referendum in November 1852. On the 2nd of December 1852, the 44-year-old Louis Napoleon Bonaparte became Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, re-establishing the imperial throne that had been vacated by his uncle 37 years earlier. The period of his reign would become known as the Second French Empire, after the First French Empire of his uncle. One of his first concerns was the succession. His mistress, Lizzie Howard, continued to play an important role in his private life, but her humble origins disqualified her from being empress. The first Napoleon had eventually discarded Josephine in favour of an Austrian royal bride in 1810, and his nephew proved equally ruthless. In late 1852, he had taken an interest in the 27-year-old Maria Eugenia, the daughter of the late Count de Montijo, a minor Spanish aristocrat who had fought for Napoleon I half a century earlier. Louis Napoleon had unsuccessfully attempted to seduce the young woman during their first meeting 3 years earlier. Now, matters changed as he had become Emperor of the French in the interim. Despite opposition from family and friends to his marrying a Spanish woman, the couple married on the 30th of January 1853. A week earlier, the Emperor sent his secret police to break into Lizzie Howard's house to seize their correspondence. He awarded her the noble title of Countess of Beauregard and paid back her loans with interest. Despite sundering his ties with her, Napoleon III went on to have many mistresses, some of whom he maintained quite openly at court, and fathered several more illegitimate children. With his new imperial powers, Napoleon III was soon in a position to launch the transformative changes in France that he planned. One of the most enduring legacies of the Second Empire was the transformation of Paris under the direction of Baron Georges Haussmann, whom he appointed as city prefect in June 1853. Over the next 17 years, Haussmann implemented the emperor's plans to demolish much of the medieval city, replacing the narrow streets with large parks, expansive squares, and a ring of wide boulevards named after the marshals of La Grande Armée in Napoleon I's time. A few months after his appointment, Haussmann announced plans to build a grand thoroughfare named the Avenue Napoleon III, now the Avenue de l'Opéra, which led to a magnificent new opera house constructed by the architect Charles Garnier between 1861 and 1875. The transformation of Paris was accompanied by a set of policies aimed at stimulating economic growth. State and private banks sprang up to lend to entrepreneurs, and a combination of public and private funds financed the expansion of the French railway network from 4,000 kilometers to 17,000 by the end of Napoleon III's reign. The Second Empire also saw an expansion of French merchant shipping, and in 1859 construction work began on the French-led construction of the Suez Canal in Egypt, which would transform trade and communications between Europe and Asia. The state also began playing a leading role in poor relief in his time. When Paris was hit by food shortages in the summer of 1853, the emperor instructed railway operators to transport food to the capital at low rates. Between 1853 and 1855, he expanded healthcare provision for the Parisian poor and established the National Hospital at Vincennes near Paris, where injured workers received a similar standard of care to military veterans at the Invalides. Napoleon III was keen to emulate his uncle's success on the battlefield. An opportunity soon presented itself in the form of a dispute over the rights of Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox monks to access the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Sultan Abdul-Majid I of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over most of the Middle East at the time, came under pressure from both the French Emperor and Tsar Nicholas I of Russia to rule in favor of Christian access. When the Sultan dithered, Russian troops occupied the Ottoman principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia in present-day Romania. The Ottomans declared war on Russia in October 1853, but were no match for the Russians, who destroyed the Ottoman fleet at Sinope in the Black Sea in November. The British and French wanted to prevent Russian expansion in the Balkans and demanded the Russian evacuation of Moldavia and Wallachia. When this was refused, Britain and France declared war at the end of March 1854. Russian troops were quickly forced to withdraw from the principalities. The British and French aimed to further curb Russian power by invading the Crimean Peninsula and laying siege to the port of Sevastopol. The Russian garrison fought tenaciously, and despite several victories on the field, the French and British could not gain a decisive victory in the Crimean War. In April 1855, Napoleon III announced his intention to personally take command of French troops in the Crimea. The British government had no wish to see Napoleon's nephew commanding men in battle alongside British redcoats, and issued an invitation for Napoleon and Eugénie to make a state visit to Britain instead. Napoleon accepted, and so his direct presence in the Crimea was avoided. Eventually, French troops captured Sevastopol there in September 1855. The new Russian ruler, Tsar Alexander II, sued for peace in February 1856, and a diplomatic conference was convened in Paris by Napoleon III's foreign minister, Count Alexandre Walewski, an illegitimate son of Napoleon I, and his Polish mistress, Maria Walewska. A couple of weeks before the signing of the Peace of Paris that ended the Crimean War on the 30th of March 1856, Napoleon and Eugénie welcomed the birth of a son, who they named Napoleon Eugène Louis, known to the family simply as Louis. During his wife's pregnancy, the philandering emperor could not resist initiating an affair with Virginia, Countess of Castiglione, the 19-year-old wife of the ambassador of the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. As the leading independent kingdom of the Italian peninsula, King Victor Emmanuel II and his prime minister, Count Camillo Cavour, had ambitions to unite Italy. Countess Virginia had been instructed by Cavour to gain a sense of the French emperor's attitude towards Italian unification, though the affair was already over by the time Napoleon III offered material support after meeting Cavour in July 1858. In exchange for French support in overthrowing Austrian domination of northern Italy, Cavour agreed that the Piedmontese territories around Nice, which had long formed part of the Italian lands of the rulers of Piedmont, would be transferred to France. By April 1859, France and Sardinia-Piedmont were at war with Austria in the Second War of Italian Independence. Napoleon personally took command of troops that won substantial victories at Magenta and Solferino in northern Italy in June 1859. He negotiated a separate peace with Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria before returning to France to lead a triumphant parade along the Champs-Élysées. Cavour was outraged, but Piedmontese forces soon occupied the central Italian states regardless, and following Giuseppe Garibaldi's campaign to Sicily and Naples, the Kingdom of Italy was founded on the 17th of March 1861 under Piedmontese leadership. These wars in Europe were just two aspects of Napoleon III's foreign policy. It was he, more than anyone else in France, who set the country on the path to having a major global empire. The French had long been rivals of Britain in this regard. In the 17th and 18th centuries, they had sought to establish a presence in North America, the Caribbean, India, and parts of Africa. Yet, in almost all instances, the British had won out, often ousting the French from a particular region after conflicts like the French and Indian Wars of the 1750s and 1760s, while by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, France had lost nearly all of its overseas colonies. An effort to build a new empire had been initiated in the 1830s when the long conquest of Algeria was commenced. However, it was Napoleon III that truly set France on course to building a colonial empire which would rival that of Britain. He was particularly aggressive in Asia and the Western Pacific region. The island of New Caledonia, for instance, was occupied by the French on Napoleon's orders in 1853. In the late 1850s, the French joined the British in the Second Opium War against Qing dynasty China, extracting major trading concessions from the government after they seized Beijing. France was also active in Japan after it began opening up to the world in the 1850s and 1860s. It was French military advisors who began introducing Western methods into the Japanese military and navy in the 1860s. In Indochina, the French began establishing protectorates over Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam from 1863 onwards, while in Africa, he continued the conquest of the interior of Algeria and ordered the expansion of the French presence in Western Africa beyond the enclave which it had controlled in Senegal since the 17th century. If one examines a map of the world from the early 1920s, when the French overseas empire was at its height, there is a wall of French blue in large parts of the world, particularly in Western Africa and Indochina. For better or worse, Napoleon III was one of the key architects of this immense French empire. Napoleon's ambitions also extended to Latin America. In September 1861, he began to consider a military intervention in Mexico to install Archduke Maximilian of Austria as emperor over the Central American nation. Ever since declaring independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico had seen a succession of military officers vying for power. In the late 1850s, the radical lawyer Benito Juárez launched an uprising against the military junta. By January 1861, Juárez's men captured Mexico City. Many Mexican conservatives fled to France to seek help, where Napoleon III was sympathetic towards the idea of establishing a Catholic empire in Mexico to counteract the influence of the broadly Protestant United States. Furthermore, the outbreak of the American Civil War in April 1861 had limited the prospect of American intervention against this French interference in the affairs of Central America. Napoleon believed that placing Archduke Maximilian on the Mexican throne could induce Austria to give up Venice to his Italian allies, which it had managed to retain at the end of the Second War of Italian Independence. A further catalyst for intervention came in July 1861, when Juárez defaulted on Mexico's foreign loans. Thus, in December 1861, Spanish, British, and French forces landed at the port of Veracruz in an effort to compel the Mexican government to pay its debts. While the Spanish and British abandoned the enterprise in April 1862, the French stayed behind to be routed by Juárez's troops in May. Napoleon responded by sending reinforcements, and by October, more than 25,000 French troops were in Mexico. The French occupied Mexico City in June 1863. Shortly afterwards, the occupation authorities organized a rigged referendum, and Maximilian agreed to sail to Mexico in April 1864 to become emperor of a country he had never even been to. While all of this was occurring across the Atlantic Ocean, on the domestic front at home in France, Napoleon had liberalized his regime by relaxing press censorship, which had been strictly enforced in the first years of his reign, and by strengthening the legislature in 1861. The November 1863 legislative elections delivered the emperor's supporters a large majority, but anti-government candidates also increased their vote share threefold. Napoleon III made further concessions to the Liberals by dismissing his cousin, Count Walewski, who had become unpopular, from the foreign ministry, and his old ally Persigny as interior minister. These were just the first of several moves towards a more liberal rule at home in France during the 1860s. In 1864, for instance, Napoleon gave French workers the right to strike, followed by the right to organize into workers' unions in 1866. He continued to subsidize the construction of low-cost housing for workers and set up a state insurance fund for disabled workers and peasants. While the conservative Empress Eugénie tended to oppose the liberal reforms, she supported her husband in expanding educational opportunities for women and taking control of education policy away from the Catholic Church, beginning the battle between church and state over education that would characterize French education policy for the remainder of the 19th century. Though he is often viewed as a despot who overthrew the Second French Republic, these were significant moves by Napoleon III, and he can be viewed as a liberal autocrat in many ways. Not everything went well for the French emperor during these years. Several thousand miles away, Emperor Maximilian was pursuing similar reforms in Mexico, but these measures acted against the conservatives on whose support he relied to control the country. Although an Austrian royal, he also remained entirely dependent on French military support. Napoleon realized, belatedly, that he had made a mistake in Mexico, where over 30,000 French troops were draining the empire's resources. Meanwhile, Juárez's guerrilla campaign was receiving American support once the American Civil War came to an end in 1865. In April 1866, the French began a phased withdrawal from Mexico, prompting Maximilian to send his wife, Empress Carlotta, to Paris to plead his cause. While Napoleon advised Maximilian to evacuate with the French troops, the courageous Austrian chose to fight on. In June 1867, 3 months after the last French troops left Mexico, Maximilian was executed by firing squad alongside 2 of his generals. The unhappy Mexican affair was symptomatic of the decline in the Second Empire's fortunes more broadly in the late 1860s. The emperor's health was also deteriorating. From 1865, he was suffering from a bladder stone that caused him intermittent pain, while in March 1865, he mourned the death of his half-brother, the Duc de Morny, at the comparatively young age of 54. Although the two men had never been close personal friends, de Morny had been one of Napoleon's more effective political advisers. The emperor seemed to lose his earlier confidence, and there were even rumors that he intended to abdicate in favor of his son. While the Bonapartists retained a large majority in the legislative elections of May 1869, pro-government conservatives lost ground, and in January 1870, the emperor appointed the reforming politician Émile Ollivier as prime minister. Ollivier quickly made his presence known by demanding Empress Eugénie's exclusion from cabinet meetings. The emperor regained the initiative in April by holding a referendum seeking approval for the social reforms enacted since 1860. He received over 7 million votes in favor compared to 1.5 million against. With this, Napoleon now had a large renewed mandate and was convinced that he had secured the succession for his son, the 14-year-old Prince Imperial. Within 6 months, the Second French Empire faced a deadly new threat in the form of the Kingdom of Prussia, whose Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, was determined to achieve German unification through military force. Following a near-death experience at the hands of Napoleon I in 1806, the Prussian kingdom had rebuilt its power during the first half of the 19th century. Under Bismarck's direction from 1862 onwards, it emerged as the leading German state, with a position of leadership over the 24 or so smaller independent German states like Bavaria and Baden. Bismarck did so by winning 2 wars, against Denmark in 1864 and then Austria in 1866. Napoleon III remained neutral in these conflicts, though his Italian ally threw in their lot with the Prussians against the Austrians in 1866 in the hopes of finally acquiring control of Venice. Napoleon believed that the war would take years, but instead, the Prussians emerged victorious within a matter of weeks. The annexation of several northern and central German states by Prussia left France vulnerable on its eastern frontier. Upon recognizing his mistake, Napoleon attempted to gain control of Luxembourg and its formidable fortresses, but was only able to secure the demolition of its defences in 1867 and its neutrality. Hence, Napoleon played a pivotal role in ensuring Luxembourg emerged as an independent state rather than as part of Germany. On the other side, Bismarck believed that a victorious war against France was a necessary condition to unite the northern and southern German states under Prussian leadership. In the end, he managed to coerce Napoleon into aggressive action by promoting the candidacy of Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern, a member of the Prussian royal family, to the throne of Spain in 1870, the implication being that France could end up surrounded by states ruled by German kings. A diplomatic meeting between Napoleon's ambassador to Prussia and King Wilhelm I of Prussia at the spa town of Bad Ems on the 13th of July 1870 only served to deepen the diplomatic crisis. In Berlin, Bismarck edited the King's telegram describing the meeting at Bad Ems to make the exchange appear more hostile than it had been. As Bismarck had intended, public opinion in France considered the Ems dispatch an outrageous insult, and the French cabinet voted in favour of war, which was declared on the 19th of July, 1870. Though he was in increasingly poor health by this time, Napoleon decided to take personal command of the army, leaving Paris on the 28th of July with his 14-year-old son and appointing Eugène as regent in Paris. Despite the general feeling of optimism, the French army was hopelessly unprepared to deal with an onslaught by the Prussian military, the finest army in Europe at that time. The French advance into Germany came to an end within days. The Prussian troops launched a devastating counter-offensive on the 4th of August, crushing the valiant French defenders with murderous artillery fire. While the Emperor relinquished command on the 17th, the Empress insisted that he remain at the front. With Eugène directing troop movements from Paris, Napoleon sent his son back to Paris and accompanied Marshal Patrice de MacMahon's army as it marched towards Metz to relieve Marshal Achille Bazaine's army of 175,000 men. On the 1st of September, the German commander Hermann von Moltke attacked MacMahon's army at Sedan in northeastern France. The French army soon found itself trapped between two German armies, and Marshal MacMahon was wounded early in the battle. In the early afternoon, the Emperor raised the white flag and was taken into Prussian captivity, while the capitulation of 83,000 Frenchmen was agreed the following morning. Defeat at Sedan proved the death knell for the Second Empire. The Third Republic was established in Paris 3 days later. Eugénie escaped from the Tuileries and fled to England, where her son was already awaiting her. On the 5th of September 1870, the deposed former Emperor Napoleon III took up residence at the Wilhelmshöhe Palace near Kassel in central Germany, which King Wilhelm had placed at his disposal while the war was still underway in France. As their former emperor languished in his palatial prison, the Republican government continued to fight on, refusing Bismarck's demands to cede the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Prussia. Paris, though, was under siege, and it was only a matter of time before it fell to the Germans. On the 18th of January 1871, King Wilhelm of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser of the new German Empire. 10 days later, Paris capitulated after a 4-month siege. The new president, Adolphe Thiers, conceded the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, a national humiliation that France was desperate to avenge over the coming decades, sowing the seeds for French involvement in the First World War. On the 1st of March 1871, the National Assembly ratified the peace agreement with Germany and formally deposed Napoleon III, holding him solely responsible for the recent calamity. Given this state of affairs, it was clear that Napoleon, like his uncle before him, would spend his final years in exile from France. The fallen emperor left Wilhelmshöhe in mid-March and arrived in England the following day. He moved into Camden Place, a country house in Chislehurst in Kent, which Eugénie had leased. It was an infinitely more salubrious setting than Napoleon I had lived out his final years in on St. Helena. From Kent, the former emperor regularly took the train to London and made occasional visits to Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace. He was grateful for his friends in England, but continued to follow events in France and had ambitions to return to restore the empire for his son, who he hoped would become Emperor Napoleon IV one day. To ensure that he could ride a horse without discomfort, in December 1872, his doctors engaged a British surgeon, Sir Henry Thompson, to perform an operation to break his bladder stone. The procedure was only partially successful and caused the patient great pain. The complications resulting from it contributed to his death at 64 years of age on the 9th of January 1873. He was buried a week later at St. Mary's Church in Chislehurst. 6 years later, his son, Prince Louis Napoleon, was killed in a skirmish while serving in the British Army during the Anglo-Zulu War. In 1881, the grief-stricken Eugénie founded a Benedictine abbey of St. Michael in Farnborough in Hampshire to serve as a mausoleum for her family. Following her death at the age of 94 in 1920, Eugénie was buried alongside her husband and son in the crypt. Napoleon III left behind a complex legacy in France. His reign ended very badly, but this came after 2 decades in which he laid the foundations for the empire that France ruled over across large parts of Africa and Asia, while his domestic policies were successful in many respects. As a child, he had been brought up in Napoleon I's inner circle, but was forced to spend much of his life in exile after his uncle's fall from power in 1815. Although he had always been conscious of the Bonapartist legacy, it was not until the 1830s that he began his active quest for power, leading 2 ham-fisted attempts at seizing power at Strasbourg and Bologna, leading to a lengthy imprisonment and a daring escape. He was far more cautious in his successful bid for power after the fall of King Louis Philippe at the time of the Revolution of 1848. Thereafter, he gradually claimed absolute power, becoming president of the new French Republic first, and then proclaiming himself as emperor in the early 1850s, just like his uncle had done half a century earlier. During more than 2 decades as president and emperor, Napoleon III presided over the development of French industry, furthered French economic and colonial interests in Asia, and defined an age of cultural splendor exemplified by the reconstruction of Paris, a city which owes much to this second Bonaparte ruler of France. While his natural instincts were conservative, he introduced social reforms to support the poor, elderly, and disabled, and gave workers the right to organize and strike. However, Napoleon III was also responsible for the foreign and military policy failures that led to the collapse of his empire in the Franco-Prussian War. It was a mixed legacy, though not an entirely unsuccessful one. What do you think of Napoleon III? Was he a successful ruler who deserves credit for major social, cultural, and economic advances in France? Or was he an inept monarch whose desire for personal glory covered up fundamental weaknesses in the French state that led to France being eclipsed by Germany from 1871 onwards? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.